Long before wooden ships cut across the Atlantic horizon, before flags were pressed into unfamiliar soil, before the word America was ever spoken in a European tongue, the continent was already alive. It breathed. From the frozen Arctic tundra to the humid forests of the southeast, from the vast Great Plains to the towering red cliffs of the southwest, the land pulsed with human movement, language, ceremony, trade, laughter, law, and memory. Rivers were not empty waterways waiting to be mapped. They were highways. Forests were not wilderness. They were carefully understood ecosystems. Plains were not vacant stretches of grass. They were homelands. Millions of people lived here, not scattered aimlessly, not surviving at the mercy of nature, but organized into nations, distinct political and cultural worlds with identities as strong and complex as any kingdom in Europe or empire in Asia. The idea that North America was an untouched wilderness in 1491 is one of the most persistent myths in Western history. It suggests emptiness, silence, a blank canvas. But the truth is far more powerful. The continent was a mosaic of civilizations. In the Mississippi River Valley, a great city rose from the earth itself. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was home to tens of thousands of people around the 11th century. Its massive earthen mounds, constructed basket by basket, stood taller than most European buildings of their time. Monk's Mound, the largest, covered more ground than the base of Egypt's Great Pyramid. This was not a village. It was an urban center, complete with plazas, neighborhoods, ceremonial spaces, and astronomical alignments. Hundreds of miles away in the southwest, the people of Chaco Canyon engineered monumental stone buildings aligned with solar and lunar cycles. Multi-story great houses rose from the desert floor, built with precision masonry. Roads radiated outward for miles, straight, intentional, connecting communities across vast distances. In what is now Colorado, the ancestral Puebloans carved entire homes into cliff faces at Mesa Verde. These dwellings were architectural achievements, strategically positioned, thermally efficient, and socially organized. Further east, dense woodlands supported agricultural societies that cultivated maize, beans, and squash, the three sisters, in sophisticated intercropping systems that replenished the soil. Farming here was not primitive experimentation, it was ecological expertise passed down through generations. The land was not untouched, it was managed. Indigenous communities used controlled burns to shape forests, encourage game movement, and maintain biodiversity. They redirected water for irrigation. They planted orchards. They engineered fish weirs in rivers. What later colonists would describe as natural abundance was often the result of centuries of intentional stewardship. Across the continent, languages flourished, hundreds of them. Each language carried its own worldview, cosmology, humor, metaphors, and political vocabulary. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the Northeast developed a sophisticated system of governance that unified multiple nations under shared laws while preserving local autonomy. Their Great Law of Peace structured diplomacy, consensus building, and conflict resolution in ways that impressed later European observers. These were not tribes wandering without structure. These were nations negotiating alliances, forming confederacies, waging wars, and maintaining trade agreements. Trade routes stretched thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lakes has been found far to the south. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast traveled inland. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains moved across regional networks. Goods flowed not randomly, but on established pathways connecting communities that knew one another, sometimes as allies, sometimes as rivals. Markets existed, diplomats traveled, messengers carried news. This was a continent in motion. Population estimates vary, but many historians suggest that before European contact, the population of the Americas, North, Central, and South combined, may have ranged between 50 and 60 million people. North America alone likely held millions. Cities rose and fell over centuries. Societies adapted to climate shifts. Political boundaries shifted. This was history in progress, not prehistory.
Children were born into structured communities. Elders carried oral histories stretching back generations. Laws were debated. Ceremonies marked seasons. Art adorned pottery, textiles, and ceremonial objects. Astronomy guided planting cycles and spiritual calendars. And perhaps most importantly, identity here was tied to place. Mountains were not obstacles to conquer, they were ancestors. Rivers were not resources to exploit, they were living presences woven into origin stories. Land ownership was not a commodity system in the European sense, it was a network of responsibilities. To belong to the land meant to care for it. When European explorers later described vast empty lands, they often misunderstood what they were seeing. Indigenous land use did not resemble fenced farms and stone cities in every region. Some communities were semi-nomadic, moving seasonally in patterns refined over centuries. Mobility was not disorder, it was adaptation. The Great Plains, for example, supported societies deeply attuned to bison migration patterns. Movement across territory was strategic, ecological, and communal. Social networks extended across wide geographic spaces. In the Pacific Northwest, coastal nations built large plank houses and developed rich maritime economies centered around salmon fishing. Totem poles, carved with intricate symbolism, told genealogical and spiritual histories. Wealth was measured not just in material goods, but in generosity, displayed in potlatch ceremonies that redistributed resources and reinforced social bonds. In the southeast, complex chiefdoms governed large populations. Platform mounds marked ceremonial centers. Fields of maize stretched outward from villages. Political authority intertwined with spiritual leadership. No single narrative can capture the diversity of this world. That is the point. There was no singular Native American culture. There were hundreds. Different languages, different clothing styles, different housing structures, different spiritual traditions, different political systems. The Arctic Inuit communities engineered survival technologies suited for extreme cold: kayaks, insulated clothing, snow houses. Desert societies developed irrigation canals and drought-resistant agriculture. Woodland nations built longhouses capable of housing extended families under one roof. Every region reflected innovation. And yet for centuries, textbooks condensed all of this into a single chapter, often beginning the story of America only when Europeans arrived. But history did not begin with contact, it continued through it. Archaeological evidence reveals deep time here. Sites like Poverty Point in Louisiana show monumental earthworks constructed thousands of years ago. Serpent Mound in Ohio curves across the landscape in astronomical alignment. These structures required organized labor, planning, and shared symbolic meaning. People gathered, they built, they remembered. Oral traditions preserved migration stories, environmental knowledge, and moral codes. In cultures where writing systems differed from European alphabets or relied on oral transmission, knowledge was not absent, it was embodied. Storytelling was archive, memory was library. The continent thrived not because it was untouched, but because it was understood. Environmental historians increasingly argue that what Europeans perceived as wilderness was often shaped by human intervention. Controlled burning created open forests, agricultural fields were rotated to maintain soil health, game populations were managed. In some regions, dense populations rivaled European urban centers at the same period. Cahokia's population around 1100 may have exceeded that of London at the time. Let that settle for a moment. While medieval Europe grappled with feudal fragmentation and periodic famine, North America held thriving urban centers connected by trade and ritual. This doesn't romanticize the past. Indigenous societies experienced conflict, warfare, power struggles, and social hierarchy like any human civilization. But complexity is not deficiency, it is evidence of development. There were diplomats and warriors, farmers and artisans, spiritual leaders and political strategists. Time moved here in cycles, tied to seasons, migrations, celestial events. In the northeast woodlands, maple sugaring marked spring. In the southwest, solstice alignment signaled agricultural transitions. Along river valleys, flood cycles shaped planting decisions. Knowledge accumulated through observation. The land was teacher. And so, on the eve of 1492, when European ships prepared to cross the Atlantic, they were not heading towards an empty frontier. They were sailing towards one of the most culturally diverse, politically dynamic, and environmentally engineered regions on Earth. They were approaching a continent already alive. Smoke from cooking fires curled above villages. Children played near riverbanks. Traders traveled established paths. Councils debated decisions that would shape the next season. Ceremonies honored ancestors who had walked those lands for millennia. The rhythms of life continued uninterrupted, unaware of the transformations soon to arrive. The story of America does not begin with arrival. It begins with presence, with nations rooted in place, with cities built of earth and stone, with fields cultivated through ecological partnership.
Long before cities rose from river valleys, before earth mounds shaped the Mississippi skyline, before councils gathered beneath wooden longhouses, there was a journey. It did not begin in America. It began in motion. More than 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, the world looked radically different. Vast sheets of ice locked up enormous amounts of water, causing sea levels to drop dramatically. Shorelines expanded. Continents that are now separated by ocean were, for a time, connected by land. Between what we now call Siberia and Alaska, a wide stretch of land emerged. It was not a narrow bridge, not a fragile crossing, but an immense subcontinent known today as Beringia. Beringia was not simply a pathway, it was a place. Grasslands stretched across it. Herds of mammoth, bison, and caribou roamed its plains. Rivers carved across its surface. For thousands of years, human groups lived there, not just passing through, but surviving, adapting, raising children beneath cold skies. These were not reckless wanderers chasing mystery. They were skilled Ice Age hunters. They understood animal migration patterns. They crafted tools from stone and bone. They sewed hides from thick enough to withstand Arctic winds. They lived in small bands, bound by kinship, cooperation, and shared knowledge. At some point, no single day, no dramatic moment, a decision was made. Or perhaps no decision was needed. They followed the herds. As animals moved eastward into new grazing grounds, human communities moved with them. Step by step, season by season, generation by generation, they entered what would eventually become Alaska. There was no sign reading New World. There was no awareness of continental boundaries. There was simply land stretching ahead. And so, the first footsteps touched American soil. For decades, the dominant theory suggested that once these early peoples reached Alaska, they waited. Massive ice sheets covered much of Canada, forming an impassable barrier. Then, as the climate warmed and glaciers retreated around 13,000 years ago, an ice-free corridor opened between them. Through this corridor, it was believed, humans moved south into the heart of North America. This theory shaped textbooks for much of the 20th century, but science evolves. Archaeological discoveries began challenging the simplicity of that narrative. Sites such as Monte Verde in Chile, dating back at least 14,500 years, suggested that humans were already deep in South America before the supposed ice-free corridor was fully open. That raised a question that still fascinates researchers today. How did they move so quickly? Increasingly, many scholars support a coastal migration theory. Rather than wading inland, some early groups may have traveled along the Pacific coastline, moving by foot and possibly by small watercraft. The coastline during the Ice Age looked very different. Sea levels were lower, exposing rich marine environments filled with fish, shellfish, and kelp forests. The Kelp Highway, as some researchers call it, may have offered a steady food supply, stretching from Northeast Asia down the western edge of the Americas. Imagine that journey. Cold ocean winds, rocky shores, glacial peaks rising in the distance, families navigating tides, carrying tools, telling stories beside driftwood fires. It would not have been a single migration. It was likely many. Genetic studies suggest multiple waves of movement over thousands of years. Populations split, adapted to new climates. Some remained in Arctic regions, others moved south into temperate forests. Still others crossed mountain ranges and entered vast interior plains. What matters is not only how they traveled, but how they transformed. Within a few thousand years, a blink in geological time, humans had adapted to nearly every ecological zone in the Americas. In the Arctic, they engineered survival technologies for sub-zero temperatures. In the Pacific Northwest, they mastered maritime ecosystems. In the Southwest, they learned to cultivate crops in arid deserts. In the Great Plains, they followed massive herds across open grasslands. This was not accidental settlement, it was innovation. One of the most famous early archaeological cultures in North America is known as Clovis, named after spear points discovered near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s. These distinctively fluted stone points date to around 13,000 years ago and were once believed to represent the first Americans. The Clovis people were highly skilled tool makers. Their spear points were carefully shaped, symmetrical, and efficient for hunting large Ice Age mammals like mammoth and mastodon. For decades, Clovis first dominated academic thought. But as new sites were uncovered, older sites, the narrative shifted. Archaeology is a conversation across time. Pre-Clovis sites began appearing. Monte Verde in Chile, Paisley Caves in Oregon, Meadow Crock Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, Bluefish Caves in Canada. Each added evidence that humans were present in the Americas earlier than once believed. The timeline stretched backward. Instead of a single migration around 13,000 years ago, evidence now suggests humans may have arrived at least 16,000 to 20,000 years ago, possibly earlier. And still, the story is unfolding. What makes this migration extraordinary is not simply its distance, but its persistence. There was no centralized expedition, no empire funding exploration, no written maps. These movements happened through countless small decisions, families choosing to follow opportunity, to seek stability, to respond to environmental change. Climate shaped everything. The end of the Ice Age brought dramatic transformations. Glaciers melted, sea levels rose, landscapes flooded. What had once been dry coastal plains disappeared beneath the ocean. Entire archaeological sites likely now rest underwater, hidden beneath modern shorelines. This means the story we know is incomplete. Every new discovery has the potential to revise the timeline again. But even within uncertainty, one truth stands firm. The peopling of the Americas was one of the greatest human migrations in history. Consider the scale. From northeastern Asia to the southern tip of South America is over 9,000 miles. Within a few thousand years, humans had spread across this entire distance. They crossed mountains, rivers, forests, tundra, deserts. They encountered unfamiliar animals and new plant species. They adapted hunting strategies. They experimented with local resources. They developed regional identities shaped by geography. Over time, isolation created diversity. Languages diverged. Cultural practices evolved. Technologies refined to suit climate and terrain. The descendants of those first migrants became the ancestors of hundreds of distinct nations. Their origin story was not one of sudden appearance, it was one of endurance. Archaeological evidence reveals intimate details of their lives. Stone tools show wear patterns from cutting meat and scraping hides. Hearth remains preserve charcoal from ancient fires. Burial sites reflect ritual and belief. At Anzick, Montana, the remains of a young child buried over 12,000 years ago were discovered with carefully crafted Clovis tools. Genetic analysis confirmed a direct ancestral connection to modern Native American populations. This was not an abstract culture. This was a child, mourned and honored. Migration stories are often told in grand, sweeping language, but on the ground, they are deeply personal. They are about mothers carrying infants across difficult terrain, hunters risking injury in pursuit of food, elders preserving knowledge of weather patterns and edible plants.
The first footsteps in the Americas were not heroic in a mythic sense. They were human. They were cautious, determined, observant, and they did not see themselves as pioneers of a new continent. They saw themselves as surviving. Over generations, as populations expanded, societies became more regionally rooted. Nomadic bands in some areas gradually established seasonal camps. In other regions, permanent settlements formed earlier, particularly where environmental conditions allowed stable food sources. By 10,000 years ago, human presence was widespread across both North and South America. The Ice Age megafauna, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, began disappearing. Scientists still debate the extent to which climate change, human hunting, or a combination of both contributed to their extinction. What is clear is that ecosystems transformed. Human communities adapted again. They shifted towards diversified diets, fish, small game, gathered plants. They developed grinding stones for seeds. They began domesticating certain crops in different regions. The seeds of later civilizations were planted during this deep past. It's tempting to compress this era into a single migration event, but history rarely moves that cleanly. Instead, imagine waves, groups arriving at different times, some overlapping, some merging, stories blending, technology spreading through exchange, knowledge accumulating. By the time agriculture developed independently in parts of Mesoamerica thousands of years later, the descendants of those first migrants had already shaped the continent for millennia. Their journey did not end when they arrived. Arrival was only the beginning. From Beringia's wind-swept plain,
Long before European cathedrals pierced the skyline of medieval cities, before castles crowned hills across England and France, before the word skyscraper ever existed, monumental architecture was already rising across North America. Not from marble, not from carved limestone blocks pulled by draft animals, but from earth, from stone, from wood, from vision, and from organization. Because cities do not build themselves. They require labor, planning, leadership, food surplus, social structure, belief systems powerful enough to move thousands of people toward a shared project. For generations, popular imagination described pre-Columbian North America as sparsely populated by small, simple villages. But archaeology tells a different story, one of urban centers, engineered landscapes, and architectural precision. The most striking example stood along the Mississippi River floodplain, Cahokia. Around 1050 CE, Cahokia was the largest city north of Mexico. At its height, it may have housed 15,000 to 20,000 people, possibly more. To put that into perspective, London at the same time was not dramatically larger. This was not a scattered settlement, it was a planned urban center. From a distance, Cahokia would have appeared as a landscape reshaped by human hands. Massive earthen mounds rose from the flat floodplain, arranged around a vast central plaza. The largest of them, Monk's Mound, still stands today, covering over 14 acres and rising approximately 100 feet tall. It was constructed entirely by hand. Basket by basket, workers carried soil from surrounding areas. Layer upon layer was compacted and shaped into a terraced pyramid. No draft animals, no wheeled carts, just coordinated labor. To build something of that scale required more than strength. It required administration. Someone organized the workforce. Someone directed the placement of soil. Someone understood load-bearing structures well enough to prevent collapse. Atop Monk's Mound likely stood an important building, perhaps the residence of a leader, perhaps a ceremonial structure. From that height, one could look out across the plaza and see a living city. Wooden homes clustered in neighborhoods. Public buildings stood near ceremonial spaces. A large wooden structure known today as Woodhenge functioned as a solar calendar, marking solstices and equinoxes with remarkable accuracy. Time itself was measured in wood and shadow. Cahokia was not isolated. It sat at the center of an enormous trade network that stretched across the continent. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, and stone from distant quarries have all been found there. This was economic integration. It was also cultural influence. Cahokia's artistic styles, especially symbolic motifs carved into shell and stone, spread across regions. Its political power likely extended outward through alliances and tribute networks. But Cahokia was not the only center of architectural brilliance. Travel west, across plains and into desert, and another world emerges: Chaco Canyon. In what is now northwestern New Mexico, between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, the ancestral Puebloans constructed monumental stone buildings known as Great Houses. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, contained over 600 rooms in rows multiple stories high. 600 rooms. Imagine the coordination required to quarry stone, transport timber from distant mountains, shape sandstone blocks into consistent forms, and stack them into symmetrical walls aligned with astronomical events. Chaco's builders understood engineering. Their masonry techniques included core and veneer construction, small stones and rubble forming the core, carefully shaped sandstone blocks creating a stable outer layer. Walls were thick and insulated against desert temperature extremes. Timber beams used in ceilings were hauled from forests over 50 miles away. That required logistics. It required planning routes, organizing labor teams, and timing construction seasons. And then there were the roads. Chacoan roads extended outward in straight lines across the desert landscape, some stretching for miles. They were wide, far wider than simple footpaths, and often cut directly through terrain rather than following natural contours. Why such precision? Scholars debate their function: trade routes, pilgrimage pathways, symbolic expressions of connection, perhaps all of the above. Chaco Canyon was not merely a settlement, it was a regional center of ceremony, governance, and exchange. Its buildings were aligned with celestial events. Windows and doorways captured sunlight during solstices. Petroglyphs marked lunar cycles. Architecture here was cosmology made visible. Further north, tucked into the cliffs of what is now Colorado, Mesa Verde tells yet another story. Between 600 and 1300 CE, the ancestral Puebloans constructed cliff dwellings, entire communities built into natural alcoves carved into sandstone canyon walls. Cliff Palace, the largest of these, contains over 150 rooms and multiple kivas, circular ceremonial chambers partially built underground. Why build into cliffs? Protection may have been a factor, so may have climate regulation. The stone overhangs provided shade in summer and insulation in winter. Construction materials were locally available. Access could be controlled. But beyond practicality, there is aesthetic brilliance. Stone walls rise against the pale rock face with geometric precision. Doorways are framed cleanly. Multi-level structures create visual harmony between natural and human architecture. These were not desperate refuges, they were deliberate communities. Agriculture supported them. The ancestral Puebloans cultivated maize, beans, and squash using terracing and water conservation techniques adapted to arid environments. They understood rainfall patterns, soil conditions, and seasonal cycles. Their survival depended not on luck, but on knowledge. Across the Southeast, different societies reshaped their environments with equally impressive ambition. At sites like Moundville in Alabama and Etowah in Georgia, platform mounds rose as ceremonial and political centers. These earthen structures required organized labor and likely symbolized social hierarchy. Large plazas between mounds hosted gatherings, rituals, and governance assemblies. The Mississippian cultural tradition, which included Cahokia, extended across much of the eastern United States. Shared iconography, known today as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, linked communities across hundreds of miles. Symbols traveled, ideas traveled.
Architecture reflected shared meaning. To call these societies primitive ignores the complexity visible in every mound, every aligned wall, every engineered field. Primitive societies do not construct solar observatories. Primitive societies do not coordinate thousands of laborers. Primitive societies do not maintain continental trade networks. What they lacked were stone fortresses in the European style. What they lacked were written alphabets preserved on parchment. But complexity does not depend on European benchmarks. In the Northeast, longhouse communities of the Haudenosaunee housed extended families under single wooden structures, sometimes over 100 feet long. These buildings reflected social organization, clans, matrilineal lineage, communal living. Political unity among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy created a diplomatic system that managed relations among multiple nations. Their Great Law of Peace structured governance long before European constitutions were drafted. Architecture and politics often moved together. Urban planning at Cahokia reflected hierarchy and ritual centralization. Great houses at Chaco signaled regional coordination. Cliff dwellings reflected environmental adaptation. Mound complexes in the southeast symbolized layered social structures. Even in regions where permanent monumental architecture was less common, landscape engineering flourished. In the Amazon basin, long dismissed as incapable of sustaining large populations, archaeologists have discovered evidence of massive earthworks, raised agricultural fields, and complex settlements hidden beneath forest canopy. In the Great Lakes region, copper mining occurred thousands of years ago. Tools and ornaments crafted from native copper circulated through trade. Across the plains, communal hunting strategies such as buffalo jumps required coordination among large groups. Entire herds were directed towards cliffs in organized drives. Engineering is not always stone. Sometimes it's social coordination. And then there is scale. Consider the labor behind Monk's Mound again. Estimates suggest millions of basket loads of soil were required. That represents years of coordinated efforts. To sustain such a workforce, agriculture had to produce surplus. Leaders had to mobilize labor without destroying social cohesion. Ritual and political authority likely intertwined to motivate participation. Cities are systems. Food production supports population density.
When Europeans first described the peoples of North America, they often used a single word: tribes. It sounded simple, small, fragmented, informal. The word implied loose bands of people tied together by kinship but lacking formal governance. It suggested societies without law, without diplomacy, without political structure beyond immediate survival. But that word concealed far more than it revealed. Because long before European crowns claimed sovereignty across oceans, the continent of North America was already divided, not into random clusters of families, but into nations. Nations with territory, nations with law, nations with alliances, rivalries, trade agreements, and diplomatic protocols. To understand this political landscape, one must set aside the European template of monarchy and parliament. Governance in indigenous North America did not mirror medieval Europe, but it was no less structured. In the northeastern woodlands, stretching across what is now New York State and into Canada, 5 nations formed one of the most sophisticated political alliances in pre-Columbian North America. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse. European observers later called them the Iroquois Confederacy. According to Haudenosaunee tradition, long before European arrival, their nations were locked in cycles of violence. Conflict between the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca created instability across the region. Then came a vision. A spiritual leader known as the Peacemaker, along with a statesman named Hiawatha, carried a message of unity. The story tells of persuasion, negotiation, and the planting of a great tree of peace. Beneath its roots, weapons of war were buried. Whether one interprets this origin story spiritually, symbolically, or historically, What followed was a confederacy governed by the Great Law of Peace. This was not mythic unity, it was constitutional structure. Each nation retained autonomy over its internal affairs, but sent representatives, sachems, to a grand council. Decisions required consensus, debate was structured. Leadership was not inherited through rigid monarchy, but selected through clan systems, often with significant influence from women. Haudenosaunee society was matrilineal. Clan mothers held the authority to appoint and remove male leaders. They ensured that leadership served the people, not personal ambition. Power was distributed. Balance was intentional. This was federalism centuries before the term existed. The Great Law of Peace was memorized and transmitted orally. Its principles emphasized collective welfare, restraint of authority, and unity without forced assimilation. Diplomacy with neighboring nations followed ritual protocol. Wampum belts, crafted from shell beads, recorded agreements and symbolized binding commitments. These were not decorative items, they were legal instruments, mnemonic devices encoding political memory. Treaties were not casual conversations, they were sacred agreements witnessed by community in ceremony. Further south, in the Mississippi Valley and southeast, Mississippian societies developed hierarchical chiefdoms with layered political authority. Leaders oversaw large territories centered around ceremonial mound complexes. Authority here often combined political leadership with spiritual legitimacy. Ritual reinforced power, and power reinforced ritual. Tribute systems redistributed goods and reinforced alliances. Political systems varied widely across the continent. In some regions, leadership was more decentralized. Among many plains societies, councils of respected elders and warriors guided decisions. Authority rested on reputation, wisdom, generosity, and proven ability rather than inherited title alone. Among the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, governance intertwined with ceremonial societies. Religious leaders played crucial roles in maintaining harmony between community and cosmos. Decision-making often involved consensus within clan and village structures. Complexity did not always require monumental buildings. It required social cohesion. Consider the mechanisms necessary to maintain peace among multiple nations sharing territory. Diplomacy required multilingual negotiation. It required messengers who understood protocol. It required gift exchange systems that reinforced mutual obligation. War, when it occurred, was governed by norms. Captives could be adopted to replace lost community members. Alliances shifted strategically. Balance of power mattered. These were political calculations. European explorers who entered these landscapes quickly discovered they were stepping into established geopolitical arenas. French traders seeking fur alliances navigated existing rivalries. The English encountered confederacies capable of coordinated resistance. Spanish expeditions moved through territories governed by leaders who commanded loyalty and could mobilize warriors. Colonial powers did not invent diplomacy in North America, they entered into it, and often misunderstood it. European negotiators frequently assumed centralized authority similar to their own monarchies, but in many indigenous systems, leadership was accountable to councils and clans. Agreements required collective consent. Miscommunication sometimes stemmed not from language barriers alone, but from incompatible political assumptions. Where Europeans sought land cession as permanent transfer of ownership, many indigenous leaders understood agreements as shared usage arrangements. Land, after all, was not merely property, it was relational space. Political identity was often tied to territory, not in the sense of fenced borders, but in networks of hunting grounds, farming areas, and sacred sites. Boundary lines were negotiated through usage patterns, alliances, and shared agreements. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy provides perhaps the clearest illustration of sustained political structure. Their council fire at Onondaga symbolized unity. Representatives spoke in prescribed order. Issues were debated until consensus emerged. Decisions were not rushed.
Some historians argue that aspects of Haudenosaunee governance influenced early American political thinkers. While the degree of direct influence remains debated, there is documented interaction between colonial leaders and Haudenosaunee diplomats. Benjamin Franklin admired the Confederacy's unity among distinct nations, but admiration did not prevent displacement. Still, before colonization disrupted balance, the Haudenosaunee maintained peace internally for centuries. That alone challenges assumptions about political fragility. Elsewhere in the southeast, the Creek Confederacy united multiple towns into a loose political alliance. Towns maintained autonomy while cooperating in times of war or collective need. Political identity was layered: local, regional, Confederate. On the Pacific Northwest coast, wealth and status intertwined with governance. Chiefs managed resource distribution, especially during potlatch ceremonies that reinforced social hierarchy in obligation networks. Leadership here required generosity. Hoarded wealth diminished prestige. Redistribution enhanced it. Political economy was moral economy. Across the continent, councils governed, laws existed, justice systems functioned, conflict resolution mechanisms were refined. Punishments were often restorative rather than purely punitive. Social harmony mattered. Community survival depended on reintegration where possible. This is not to romanticize. There were wars, there were power struggles, there were expansions and consolidations of influence. Human societies everywhere wrestle with ambition and fear. But conflict does not negate structure, it proves its necessity. When European settlers later described indigenous nations as lacking civil government, they often failed to recognize governance forms that did not resemble their own. Charters were absent, but constitutional memory lived in oral tradition. Stone palaces were rare in many regions, but council fires burned in structured debate. Flags did not mark every border, but diplomatic protocols defined alliances clearly. Language itself reveals misunderstanding. The term tribe implies small-scale, kin-based organization without centralized political institutions. Yet many indigenous nations commanded territories larger than European principalities. Some confederacies united multiple nations under shared law. The Haudenosaunee were not alone in this sophistication. In the Southwest, the Hopi maintained clan-based governance with ceremonial leadership guiding agricultural cycles and dispute resolution. In California, complex trade networks linked villages across ecological zones, requiring negotiation in political relationships. In the Great Plains, leadership could be situational. War chiefs rising during conflict, peace chiefs guiding diplomacy. Flexibility was strength. Political systems adapted to environment and population density. High-density agricultural regions supported hierarchical chiefdoms. Mobile societies developed fluid leadership responsive to circumstance. Both required intelligence. Both required social trust. By the time European colonization intensified, indigenous political worlds were already deeply entangled in their own alliances and rivalries. Some nations allied with French traders to counter English expansion. Others negotiated strategically with colonial governments to preserve.
Before paved highways, before railroads stitched coasts together, before shipping lanes crossed oceans, North America was already threading with routes. They were not drawn on parchment maps. They were walked. They were paddled. They were remembered. Across forests, along rivers, through deserts and over mountains, goods moved from hand to hand, village to village, nation to nation, and with them traveled stories, alliances, technologies, and belief systems. The continent was not a collection of isolated communities, it was a web. Long-distance trade in North America stretches back thousands of years. Archaeologists have uncovered copper tools from the Great Lakes region buried hundreds, even thousands of miles from their source. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast had been found deep in the Midwest. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains appears at sites far beyond the volcanic regions where it formed. These materials did not move randomly. they moved through networks. Take copper, for example. In the region surrounding Lake Superior, indigenous peoples mined native copper as early as 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. This was not surface scavenging alone. Archaeological evidence shows organized extraction, hammerstones used to detach copper from bedrock, pits dug into exposed veins. Copper was shaped into tools, spear points, ornaments, and ceremonial objects. Unlike smelted copper in later civilizations, this was cold-hammered native metal, worked through skill and patience. From the Great Lakes, copper artifacts traveled south and east. They appear in burial sites across the Mississippi Valley and beyond. Their presence signals exchange relationships extending across vast distances. But copper was only one thread. Along the Gulf Coast, marine shells, especially conch and whelk, were transformed into beads, pendants, and ceremonial items. These shells appear far inland, including at Cahokia and other Mississippian centers. Shells do not walk inland on their own. They were carried, perhaps downriver by canoe, perhaps across established land routes, perhaps traded multiple times, each exchange strengthening social bonds. Obsidian tells a similar story. This volcanic glass forms only in specific geological areas, primarily in the West. It fractures with razor-sharp edges, making it ideal for tools and weapons. By chemically analyzing obsidian artifacts, archaeologists can trace them back to their original volcanic source. The results are striking. Obsidian from one quarry might appear hundreds of miles away, revealing connections between communities separated by mountains and deserts. These were not accidental encounters, they were sustained relationships. Trade routes often followed natural corridors. Rivers functioned as highways long before roads. The Mississippi River system connected the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, creating one of the most important trade arteries in the continent. Imagine canoes gliding along these waterways, loaded with copper tools, shell beads, stone tools, dried fish, furs, pottery. Imagine stops at known villages where goods were exchanged, alongside news and ritual. Trade was economic, but it was also diplomatic. Exchange reinforced alliances, gift-giving established obligations, receiving goods created relationships. In many indigenous cultures, wealth was not measured solely by accumulation, but by generosity. Redistribution of goods enhanced prestige. In the Pacific Northwest, potlatch ceremonies demonstrated this principle vividly. Chiefs hosted elaborate gatherings where wealth, blankets, carved items, food was distributed to guests. The act of giving reinforced social rank and cemented political ties. Trade, therefore, was embedded in culture. It was not anonymous market exchange, it was relational. Consider Cahokia again. At its height, it stood at the center of a network reaching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast and beyond. Artifacts found there include marine shell ornaments, copper plates, and stone from distant regions. These goods were not simply decorative, they symbolized connection. Cahokia's influence spread through what archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a network of shared religious symbols and artistic motifs. Falcon imagery, ceremonial maces, engraved shell designs appear across multiple sites. Ideas moved with objects, trade routes became cultural highways. Even in regions where large urban centers did not dominate, exchange networks thrived. In the Southwest, Chaco Canyon appears to have functioned as a redistribution center. Exotic goods, turquoise, macaw feathers from Mesoamerica, cacao residues have been found at Chaco sites. Macaws do not fly north on their own. They were transported, alive or as feathers, across long distances. Their presence suggests connections reaching into what is now Mexico. Turquoise, mined in the Southwest, appears in Mesoamerican contexts. The exchange may have been indirect, moving through multiple intermediary communities, but the chain existed. This was continental connectivity.
On the Great Plains, trade linked nomadic hunting societies with agricultural villages. Bison hides, dried meat, and other products moved in exchange for crops and crafted goods. In the Northeast, wampum beads crafted from shell became important in diplomacy and trade. Over time, these beads held economic as well as symbolic value. Trade routes were not always peaceful. Control over strategic locations, river confluences, mountain passes, and fertile valleys could generate conflict. Political alliances often influenced access to exchange networks. Economic geography mattered. Communities positioned along major routes could accumulate influence by acting as intermediaries. They became hubs. But unlike modern capitalist systems driven by profit maximization, many indigenous trade systems operated within cultural frameworks emphasizing reciprocity and balance. A gift required a return gift. An alliance required maintenance. Trade built trust, and trust built stability. Consider the sheer scale. From the Arctic to the Gulf Coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, goods traveled across ecological zones dramatically different from one another. Copper mined in northern climates might end up in southern ceremonial centers. Shell from warm coastal waters could adorn a leader in a distant village. Obsidian shaped into a blade formed in volcanic fire. These objects cross distance through human relationship, through trust, through negotiation, through memory of paths walked before. Trade networks reveal a continent in motion, not chaotic, but coordinated. A continent bound not by empire, but by exchange. A continent where economic sophistication did not depend on written ledgers, but on social bonds strong enough to carry goods across mountains and rivers. Before Columbus, before colonies, before global markets, there were already markets of another kind, already routes, already systems, already a continent connected.
When European explorers first described North America, they often wrote of endless forests, vast plains, abundant wildlife, nature in its purest form. To them, the land seemed untouched, untamed, wild beyond measure. But what they saw was not wilderness, it was management. For thousands of years before 1492, indigenous societies across North America practiced forms of environmental science so refined, so adaptive, that modern researchers are only now beginning to fully understand their sophistication. This was not accidental harmony with nature. It was learned, tested, refined over generations. It was science, though not written in textbooks. It was agriculture, though not industrial. It was environmental mastery rooted in observation, memory, and respect. Consider maize. Maize, corn, did not originate in North America. Its ancestor, a wild grass called teosinte, was first domesticated in what is now Mexico thousands of years ago. Through selective breeding over centuries, early agriculturalists transformed a small, hard-seeded plant into a crop capable of sustaining civilizations. That transformation required experimentation. Farmers observed which plants produced larger kernels. They saved seeds from the best yields. They adapted planting methods to climate and soil. Maize slowly moved northward through trade and migration. By around 1000 CE, it had become a central crop in many parts of North America, particularly in the Mississippi Valley and eastern woodlands. But maize was rarely grown alone. Indigenous agricultural systems often relied on what became known as the Three Sisters: maize, beans, and squash, planted together in complementary patterns. The science behind this system is remarkable. Maize grows tall and provides a natural pole for climbing beans. Beans fix nitrogen in the soil, replenishing nutrients depleted by maize. Squash spreads low across the ground, shading soil, suppressing weeds, and retaining moisture. Each plant supports the others. This was not coincidence, it was ecological understanding. Fields were not randomly planted, they were designed. In the eastern woodlands,
Farmers cleared fields through controlled burning, enriching soil with ash and reducing underbrush. Crops were rotated to prevent exhaustion of nutrients. Villages often relocated every decade or so, allowing former fields to regenerate naturally. This was sustainability in motion. Agriculture in the arid Southwest required even greater adaptation. Rainfall was scarce, rivers were unpredictable, yet societies such as the Hohokam engineered extensive irrigation systems as early as 300 CE in what is now Arizona. Canals stretched for miles, diverting river water into fields. Some canals were over 10 miles long. Constructing them required surveying terrain, calculating gradient to maintain water flow without erosion, organizing labor crews, and maintaining infrastructure. Irrigation canals must be cleaned regularly. Sediment builds up, floods can damage walls, water must be allocated fairly. This is not simple farming. This is hydraulic engineering. The Hohokam sustained large populations in desert environments for centuries through these systems. Their fields supported maize, beans, squash, and cotton. Cotton, that alone tells us something about agricultural range and experimentation. Further north, the ancestral Puebloans developed terracing techniques to capture and retain scarce rainfall. Stone check dams slowed runoff in narrow canyons. Fields were placed strategically to maximize moisture retention. In mesa-top communities, farmers used waffle gardens, small grid-like depressions surrounded by low earthen walls that trapped water and protected plants from wind. These were microclimate adjustments. They reflect detailed environmental observation. In the Great Plains, agriculture blended with hunting economies. River valleys supported maize cultivation, while open grasslands provided bison. Communities timed planting and hunting cycles with seasonal precision. Knowledge passed from elder to youth ensured continuity. But agriculture was only one dimension of environmental mastery. Fire, so often associated with destruction, was a tool of renewal. Across California and the Pacific Northwest, indigenous communities practiced controlled burns for thousands of years. These low-intensity fires cleared underbrush, encouraged growth of certain plant species, reduced catastrophic wildfire risk, and improved hunting conditions. Fire stimulated the growth of plants used for basketry and medicine. It opened landscapes for easier movement. It maintained meadows within forests. European settlers, misunderstanding this practice, often suppressed fire. Over time, forests grew denser, fuel accumulated, and wildfire behavior changed dramatically. Modern forest management is increasingly rediscovering the value of controlled burning, knowledge long held by indigenous communities. In the Great Plains, fire shaped prairie ecosystems, encouraging new grass growth that attracted grazing animals. Bison thrived in these managed grasslands. In the Northeast, forest composition reflects centuries of human influence. Nut-bearing trees such as oak and chestnut were encouraged. Open forest understories made travel and hunting easier. The pristine wilderness described by early European colonists was often the result of generations of intentional ecological stewardship. Even fisheries were engineered. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, indigenous communities constructed fish weirs, wooden structures built across rivers to guide salmon into manageable channels for harvesting. These weirs allowed selective fishing, ensuring enough fish escaped upstream to reproduce. Overfishing threatened long-term survival, so harvest methods were balanced. Sustainability was not theoretical, it was practical necessity. In the Arctic, Inuit communities developed technologies precisely calibrated to extreme environments: insulated clothing stitched from caribou hides, snow houses engineered for thermal efficiency, kayaks shaped for stability in icy waters. Environmental mastery meant adaptation to every climate zone, from tundra to rainforest. And beneath it all was knowledge accumulated through observation. Plants were studied for medicinal properties, roots, bark, leaves were cataloged in memory. Knowledge of seasonal cycles dictated planting and harvesting times. Astronomy informed agriculture. In the Southwest, solar alignments marked seasonal transitions. At Chaco Canyon, architectural features align with solstices. Farming cycles were linked to celestial observation. Timekeeping was agricultural science. Soil composition was understood through experience. Farmers recognized which soils drained well, which retained moisture, which required fallowing. Seeds were preserved carefully from year to year. Drought-resistant varieties were selected in arid regions. Cold-tolerant strains developed further north. This is selective breeding. This is adaptation. Over thousands of years, maize itself diversified into numerous regional varieties, suited for short growing seasons, high altitudes, or variable rainfall. Indigenous agriculturalists were plant geneticists in practice, if not in title. In the Amazon basin, once assumed incapable of sustaining large populations, research has revealed anthropogenic soils known as terra preta. These enriched soils were created by mixing charcoal, organic waste, and other materials to improve fertility. Soil engineering, human-created ecosystems. The concept of environmental mastery in North America does not imply domination over nature. It implies relationship. Many indigenous worldviews framed humans not as separate from ecosystems, but as participants within them. Stewardship was a responsibility. Land was not a commodity to extract from indefinitely. It was a living system requiring reciprocity. This worldview shaped land use patterns. Overhunting risked future scarcity. Overharvesting plants threatened regeneration. Practices evolved to balance immediate need with long-term survival. This is resilience planning. When drought struck the Southwest in the 12th and 13th centuries, societies adapted, relocating, reorganizing, adjusting agricultural strategies. Some settlements were abandoned, but abandonment does not mean ignorance, it means flexibility. Contrast this with industrial agriculture centuries later, which often prioritized short-term yield over ecological stability. Indigenous land management sustained populations for millennia without causing irreversible ecological collapse on continental scale. Environmental historians increasingly argue that what Europeans encountered in the 15th century was a landscape profoundly shaped by human management. Open forests in the east, extensive prairies in the Midwest, productive fisheries along the coasts. These were not accidents of untouched nature, they were maintained systems. Even large game populations, such as deer and bison, were influenced by habitat management practices, including controlled burns and regulated hunting. Knowledge transmission occurred orally and experientially. Young people learned by doing, by planting, harvesting, fishing, observing. Science was embedded in culture. It was sung in songs marking seasons. It was encoded in stories explaining animal behavior. It was practiced daily. There were no universities issuing degrees, but there were generations of accumulated expertise. Agricultural surpluses supported population growth. Population growth enabled urban centers like Cahokia. Urban centers
Before maps drew borders across the continent, before churches rose in unfamiliar architectural forms, before missionaries translated prayers into new languages, North America was already alive with sacred geographies. Mountains were not just elevations. Rivers were not merely water. Animals were not only resources. The sky was not empty space. Spirituality was not confined to buildings. It moved with the seasons. It lived in stories. It was carried in memory. To understand the civilizations of North America before 1492, one must understand this. Belief systems were not decorative additions to society. They were structural foundations. They shaped governments. They informed agriculture. They guided diplomacy. They defined identity. Across the continent, spiritual traditions were diverse, just as languages and political systems were diverse. There was no single indigenous religion, no unified doctrine. Yet certain patterns appear again and again. Deep relationality, cyclical time, reverence for balance, and recognition of interconnectedness. In many Eastern woodland societies, the world was understood as layered. The sky world above, the earth world in the middle, the underworld below. These realms were not distant abstractions, they interacted. Stories told of beings who moved between worlds, tricksters, culture heroes, spirits that shaped landforms and taught survival skills. Creation narratives were not simple origin myths, they were frameworks for ethical behavior. Among Haudenosaunee, Iroquois peoples, the story of Sky Woman falling from the sky world onto the back of a turtle is more than cosmology. It explains responsibility. The earth is fragile. It is supported. It is shared. From that narrative comes the idea of stewardship, gratitude, and collective survival. Ceremonies reinforced these values. Seasonal festivals marked planting, harvest, and renewal. Thanksgiving addresses, recited before gatherings, acknowledged the people, the animals, the waters, the winds. Gratitude was structured, spoken intentionally, repeated generation after generation. Further south, in the Mississippian world, mound complexes were not merely political centers, they were sacred landscapes. Platform mounds elevated temples and council houses closer to the sky. Alignments often corresponded with solar cycles. Ritual specialists interpreted celestial events. The sun, moon, and stars were not distant objects, they were participants in earthly life. In the Southwest, ancestral Puebloan cosmology intertwined with architecture. Kivas, subterranean ceremonial spaces, represented emergence. Many Puebloan traditions describe ancestors emerging from previous worlds into this one. The Sipapu, a small hole in the floor of the kiva, symbolized that passage. Ceremony here was embodied history. In desert landscapes, where survival required acute environmental knowledge, spiritual life emphasized balance. Rain dances were not superstition, they were communal affirmations of dependence on seasonal cycles. To dance for rain was to recognize vulnerability. It was also to affirm unity. In the Arctic, Inuit cosmology reflected harsh realities of ice and sea. Spirits governed animals hunted for survival. Rituals honored seals and whales, ensuring continued balance between humans and prey. Overhunting risked spiritual as well as physical consequence. Across the Great Plains, vision quests marked personal transformation. Young individuals fasted and prayed in isolation, seeking guidance through dreams or visions. Identity was not assumed, it was revealed through experience. Spiritual knowledge often came through dreams, through elders, through ceremony. It was relational, not imposed by centralized authority. Art carried cosmology into visible form. Petroglyphs carved into canyon walls depict animals, geometric symbols, celestial patterns. These were not random decorations, they encoded stories, clan symbols, astronomical observations. Pottery designs mirrored cosmological structures. Basket patterns reflected cycles. Beadwork colors signified belonging. Identity was worn, carved, painted. Masks used in ceremonies were not costumes in the theatrical sense. They embodied beings, ancestral spirits, animal guides, transformative forces. When worn, they did not merely represent, they became. Storytelling served as archive. In societies without written alphabets, memory was refined to extraordinary precision. Oral traditions preserved genealogies, migration histories, environmental knowledge, and moral frameworks. Stories changed slightly with each teller, adapting to audience and moment, but core truths endured. Trickster figures like Coyote in the West or Raven in the Pacific Northwest taught through humor and contradiction. They were foolish and wise, destructive and creative. They reflected human complexity. Time itself was often understood cyclically rather than linearly. Seasons returned, generations echoed ancestors, ceremonies repeated patterns established long ago. This cyclical understanding shaped identity. You were not isolated from the past, you carried it. Kinship extended beyond bloodlines. Clan systems structured social organization. Animal clans, bear, wolf, eagle, turtle,
linked individuals to symbolic relationships with the natural world. To belong to a clan was to inherit responsibility. Marriage rules, political alliances, and ceremonial roles often flowed from clan identity. Spiritual and social systems intertwined seamlessly. In the Pacific Northwest, monumental totem poles told stories of lineage and mythic events. Carved figures stacked vertically represented ancestors, animals, supernatural beings. These were not idols, they were narratives in wood. Songs functioned similarly. Melodies carried ancestral memory. Certain songs belonged to specific families or ceremonial contexts. To sing without rite was disrespectful. Spiritual authority was often decentralized. Shamans, medicine people, ceremonial leaders held specialized knowledge, but power was rarely absolute. Knowledge required discipline, training, sacrifice. It was earned, not declared. Importantly, belief systems evolved. They were not frozen in time. Trade brought new ideas. Migrations introduced new ceremonial forms. Conflicts reshaped mythic narratives. Spiritual worlds were dynamic. They responded to ecological change, political transformation, and demographic shifts. Yet European observers often misunderstood what they encountered. Because spirituality was not housed in grand cathedrals, they assumed it lacked sophistication. Because doctrine was transmitted orally, they dismissed it as primitive. Because cosmology was integrated into daily life, they failed to see its structure. But complexity does not require stone arches, it requires coherence. And indigenous spiritual systems were deeply coherent. They explained origin, they prescribed ethics, they structured ceremony, they linked individual to community. Cultural identity flowed from these systems. Language itself encoded worldview. Many indigenous languages emphasize verbs over nouns, action over static categorization. This linguistic structure reflects perception of a living, moving world. Place names preserved history. A river might be named for a mythic event that occurred there. A mountain might mark a migration story. Landscape was archive. Even warfare had spiritual dimensions. Ritual preparation preceded battle. Victory or defeat carried cosmological meaning. Diplomacy invoked sacred witness. Treaties were not only political agreements, but spiritual commitments. Breaking them was more than betrayal. It disrupted balance. Death, too, was approached through ceremony. Burial practices varied widely: mound entombments, scaffold burials, cremation, but all reflected continuity between worlds. Ancestors were not gone, they remained present. In many traditions, the boundary between human and animal was permeable in story. Transformation narratives described humans becoming animals and vice versa. These were not fantasies, they expressed relational worldview. Humans are not separate from the web of life. Spiritual discipline cultivated humility. Power sought for selfish gain risked imbalance. Generosity elevated status. Sharing reinforced community survival. In some societies, wealth accumulation was counterbalanced by ceremonial redistribution. The potlatch ceremonies of the Pacific Northwest redistributed goods publicly, reinforcing social bonds and spiritual obligations. Giving created honor, not hoarding. Sacred objects like pipes, bundles, carved figures carried layered meaning. They were treated with reverence because they embodied relationship between visible and invisible realms. Colonial narratives later caricatured these practices as superstition, but such judgments reveal more